The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay in getting started, but thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to today's BATIC Institute webinar on innovative finance developments under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Today's webinar will be about an hour in length and feature a panel discussion on what transportation practitioners are thinking about the long-term investment and policy changes included in the legislation and the implications for state departments of transportation. My name is Susan Howard, and I am the director of the BATIC Institute at AASHTO. I want to let you know that there are many resources available on the BATIC Institute website in terms of what's included in the IIJA, and we have a full list of those available. I'd encourage you to dig into those on your own. We're on this particular webinar and this conversation, we're going to focus a little bit more on the long-term implications and strategies for state DOTs moving forward. A few logistical things before we get started. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. We are recording the webinar and we'll make it available on our website in the next few days. At any time, you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those during our Q&A portion of the webinar. Many of you are familiar with the BATIC Institute, but we help state DOTs and their local partner agencies analyze, understand, and use project finance techniques to advance transportation projects in their states. And we build capacity through a program of training, sharing of best practices, and online engagement like this webinar. BATIC Institute's programming is delivered in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to today's moderator, the wonderful Catherine Reddick with Mercator Advisors. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Susan. So I'm joined here by a panel of excellent transportation practitioners. I got Gail Lewis, whom you should be able to see. David Spector will be audio only, and then Anthony Buckley should be joining us as well. So I'm going to open by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves and then also just highlight for us what you're most excited about and what you're most concerned about in the legislation. Gail, can I start with you?
Sure, Catherine. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, and we apologize for the technical difficulties. But believe me, it's harder for us than it is for you. But we're going to figure it out and try and deliver a good program anyway. And we really want to thank you for taking some time to be with us today. I'm Gail Lewis. I'm a strategic advisor with HDR, working largely in P3s. Prior to joining HDR a few years ago, I was the director of the P3 program for the Arizona Department of Transportation. I started the program and saw it through for about 12 years before joining HDR. So I have lived this now sort of on both sides of the fence, and have I think a little bit better of an understanding of all the pros and cons. Of course, the IIJA is what everybody's talking about right now. It's a tremendous influx of important additional resources delivered intelligently, some of it through the regular 5-year program. So it reauthorizes the 5-year program for state DOTs. So again, that I think we have all those of us who work for DOTs, I think all lived through the days when we had to wait on pins and needles to see if the program was going to be reauthorized before it ever finally happened. Now we have not only a reauthorization, but a reauthorization at a slightly elevated level of funding for everybody. So that's great news. The rest of the funds are accessible in a number of different ways. There's a lot of new grant opportunities and rather substantial grant opportunities. So I guess my first piece of advice would be to really look carefully at those grant options and figure out how they can be of assistance to you, and don't be afraid to call certainly anybody on this panel, but anybody else as well, to ask for assistance and to get some additional resources that can help you. And those grants are very, very broadly based, and they cover all sorts of things, not just innovative financing. So, but that is in a general way the way that a lot of this program is going to get delivered. So I would really encourage you to become very familiar with those and to reach out to help anyone on this call and lots of other folks would be very, very glad to help you get started in that process. I think for purposes of this call, thinking more about innovative finance and P3s, there are a number of things that are going to be really important additions to this program. First of all, it expanded a lot of the Build America Bureau's credit enhancement programs that really can help be the final piece in funding that can make a P3 or an innovative delivery project possible. So additional funds for both TIFIA, which is the Build America Bureau's low interest program for innovative projects, an expansion, in fact, almost a doubling of private activity bonds, which can also be used to help fill in the gap for funding innovative projects, as well as some additional grant programs that the Build America Bureau is starting to use really interesting ways to expand the use of P3s around the country, one of which I believe there's a notice of funding opportunity out for this right now, which is the Regional Infrastructure Accelerator Program, which really looks to expand the knowledge and capability to do P3s away from just this, not away from the state DOTs, but in addition to the state DOTs, to regional entities such as the MPOs and COGS around the country. So I'd really encourage you to go take a look at that, that opportunity. 5 have been awarded already. There's a notice of funding opportunity now for more, and they just found out when the bill got signed literally last week that they got an additional $12 million. So there'll probably be at least one more round of funding opportunities. Again, this is a great opportunity to bring funding to local and regional agencies to learn more about P3s and to really educate cities and towns about how these tools can be used on the regional level as well as on the statewide level.
Hey,
So
Gail,
that's my sort of top line. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for getting us started. I want to just pivot quickly and let David Spector introduce himself and give us some.
Oh, I'm sorry. I went right into the substantive presentation way beyond introduction. I apologize for that. Please,
No
David,
worries.
and I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. And can folks hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So apologies that I can't be on the screen. I even got like dressed up, at least the top half, with like a sport coat and a nice button-up shirt today. So I guess all for naught. So apologies for the technical difficulties. David Spector here with KPMG's Infrastructure and Projects Advisory Practice. We advise government entities, public sector owners on their infrastructure, both their projects and strategy to help implement projects or just to become more efficient, whatever it is they're focused on. Like Gail, I came from the public sector to advisory work. I ran the Colorado Department of Transportation and the state of Colorado's P3 and Innovative Finance Office for Transportation for about 4 years. And prior to that was a lawyer, legal counsel for Governor Hickenlooper and his administration. And before that, I was a partner at the Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell law firm advising infrastructure clients on infrastructure projects, among other things. So happy to be here. Sorry I couldn't be here visually. I think Catherine just, that Gail opened a lot on IIJA, and I think it's a pretty exciting time to be in the infrastructure business. And for me, the most exciting thing is really what makes this bill different than any surface transportation reauthorization bill like Gail was talking about. I mean, really, for the first time in a generation, there's now a broad menu of infrastructure all under the same legislative roof, right? It's everything from roads, as we've traditionally seen, but now you've got things like carbon reduction. Yes, you've got traditional elements like rail, but now you've got things like wildlife crossings and electric vehicle charging infrastructure and reconnecting communities. So there's all of these categories of infrastructure that have been elevated, right, to the same level that transportation and transit had been in the past. And to me, that's the most exciting thing about IIJA. So I'll stop there, hand it back to you. Hopefully we've got Anthony, and then we can dig into some of the details.
Yeah, I think we're still working on getting Anthony connected, but I want to stick on the topic of the funding before we dive into the innovative finance provisions and just talk a
Sure.
little bit about the underlying policy and programs. And David, you alluded there to the expansion and eligibility. We're really talking about funds for a lot of new kinds of projects. And I'm wondering if you and Gail can comment a little bit on the types of funding that have been provided and how those match up with states' priorities and the projects that are in agencies' pipelines right now.
Sure, Gail. How about I start and then hand it off to you? So,
Please.
there's been, as you noted, an expansion of what I call old money, right? The programs that we're all familiar with. But in that expansion, there's a lot of new eligibility criteria. We are already seeing it, right, in terms of the raise grants. Last administration, the eligibility criteria really favored things like self-help and able to bring additional revenues to the table. And now we're seeing things like social justice and equity. We're seeing things like resiliency being some of those evaluation criteria that you really need to focus on. So I think that's something, as Gail mentioned, that folks need to be thinking about. But for me, it's really a lot of the new programs. When you look at the new funding programs that are available in this bill for broadband or environmental resilience or power infrastructure or even transportation, as you scroll through those new programs, you can see a lot of the priorities in those programs just directly. So for example, there's a clean school bus program, right? That's $5 billion have been authorized for a clean school bus program. Well, clean is green, it's environmental, it's for kids, it's for social justice, it's for sort of equity. And I think that as you look through these new programs, while you can see some of the old categories coming through, you've got brand new programs that are focused on things like reconnecting communities as a pilot program, and healthy streets and congestion relief, right? These are much softer and more human-centered focus points for this Department of Transportation. And it really expands what we've seen USDOT in particular be focused on. And I think the last thing I would say here, Gail, before I hand it off to you, is it's not just in the statute, right? At the federal level, right, you have seen guidance come out from FHWA in particular that these monies, right, should really be focused on things other than traditional capacity expansion projects in transportation. And I think that that theme is really spreads not just through the statute, but through a lot of the notice of funding opportunities and guidance pieces that you're seeing. So I think it does. States are going to have to pivot. Applicants, not just states, are going to have to really think about, did a project that 3 years ago looked really good for potential funding? Does it still look really good? Because does it have sidewalks, and does it have transit, and is it connecting communities, and those kinds of things? I think folks are really going to have to take a hard look to make sure that they're matching up their projects from the bottom up with that sort of top layer, top down program focus that we see in this bill. Gail?
David, I think you're dead on target, and that those are really interesting points, and that it does, in many ways, and I'm sure a lot of you are seeing this, in many ways it's really challenging the DOTs to think about things differently, and also to create some new partnerships. I know in Arizona, we always worked well with the Arizona Commerce Authority, and so there was a relationship there, but we weren't really delivering programs together. Now, for example, the broadband component that David talked about, that's going to end up being much more of a shared enterprise with a broadband coordinator. I believe it's in the legislation that every state's going to need to appoint a broadband coordinator within their state DOT, and it's going to be that person's job to figure out how to work with a designated broadband agency and to make sure that that's a much more integrated and collaborative relationship going forward. In many cases, it's state departments of commerce that have been given the broadband authority, but there are also several states that have an Office of Technology Development or Technology Deployment, and in some cases, those are the agencies that are going to be responsible. And that, again, is sort of a new opportunity to work with DOTs in the infrastructure space, which is quite an interesting way to think about delivering this really critical resource. It also pays a lot of attention to rural communities in a way that, of course, departments of transportation and transportation agencies are always focused on connectivity, and that sometimes goes across long distances. But we haven't had to be as concerned with exactly how that infrastructure functions and whether it can serve more than just one purpose. Maybe it can't only deliver physical relationships from place to place, but also connectivity from place to place through broadband. And that's never really happened before in an organized and encouraging way. And I think that this is a really interesting experiment. The other one that I would bring up is electric vehicle charging stations. We all know that that electric vehicles are being encouraged. We're all seeing the ads, we're all seeing them go mainstream, but to some extent we're seeing them going mainstream, and perhaps the infrastructure to make sure they can actually function from across long distances isn't in place everywhere yet. So this is really an opportunity for the state DOTs to think about that as a function, and how they can make sure that working with the private sector and some traditional locations, but also a lot of ones, can provide rapid charging stations, not only within an urban area, but also across the great expanses of this country that don't really have that infrastructure right now. And it's very interesting. And state DOTs don't really have the expertise to run EV charging stations, so that's all going to require them to form some new partnerships with the private sector. So I think both broadband and EV offer a lot of opportunities. For partnerships in a lot of interesting ways that they might not have had to deliver them before.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, and I heard nothing. Hopefully I'm not bleeding over.
We can hear you.
Okay.
I think Anthony's in the process of joining us, and so we'll come back to him a little bit later to talk about EV charging, because that's something Washington State has done a lot of work on already. So I want to pivot to a slightly different look. We've talked a lot about the good news in this legislation. Let me ask a slightly tougher question. We've all recognized that this is sort of a generational investment in infrastructure, and it comes on the heels of a wave of funding packages at the state level. So we have an increase in federal funding. We've seen increases in state funding across the country over the past 10 years or so. My question to the panel is, do we still have a transportation funding crisis, or have we solved it? Gail, David? Who wants to jump on that one?
Well, I can start, Gail. All right. Do we still have a crisis? Yes, but it's less of an acute crisis, right, than sort of a slow, lingering, crisis. I think that the challenge with IIJA and the self-help measures that you mentioned, Catherine, that states have been doing through their own gas tax increases or sales tax increases for funding, for transportation funding, is that now the story is, hey, we've got all this money for transportation, right? It's raining down from the feds. We've got the biggest infrastructure investment in a generation. But I think what keeps getting missed is that you still have a huge gap, right, in terms of what the need was been. And anybody that works at a DOT like Anthony, or worked at a DOT, like Gail or I did, knows that the money that's coming in will help, absolutely, but it will not solve all of the problems, right? There is still a huge backlog of infrastructure projects, both nationally and at the state level. And I mean, if you just think about like state of good repair, like so many states, they are getting D's or C's in terms of where they are, in terms of the maintenance of their assets. So while this is awesome, right? It really is. It's really something that we all should be very excited about. It's still not enough. I think the challenge will be, what happens next time there's a reauthorization, right? A lot of folks will say, oh, you got a lot of money, and what did you do with it? And I think we need to be thinking as an industry, right, as DOTs and as owners and as industry professionals, how can we best use this windfall really of money to help set ourselves up for the future? Because the next reauthorization may not be as robust. And not to worry anybody, but if there are changes politically, right, this is a 5-year bill, you might not get appropriations like you thought you would in years 3, 4, and 5, depending on what happens at the political level. And so using the money that we've got today out of the bill and being really thoughtful and strategic about it. What can you spend it on now? But also, what can you use? How can you leverage it, right? How can you take that money and take $1 of that money and turn it into $10 in the future? I think those are the more strategic questions that states should be asking themselves when they're thinking about how they can take advantage of the opportunities in this bill.
I really agree with that, David. And the other thing is we have put a large influx of cash over a 5-year period into the system, which is great, but we haven't really solved the problem. As long as we continue to be primarily dependent on the gas tax as our primary revenue source, we're going to have a shortfall because that is a declining revenue source. And there's nothing suggested so far that is going to really be a replacement to that. And one of the great ways of EV charging, for example, is that we're sort of sowing these seeds of our own destruction as we fund fund EVs. We're also funding vehicles that use a different fuel source and therefore a different revenue source. So that is a declining source. We've been kicking the can down the road on this for some time now. And while this is certainly a critically important temporary bridge, it really is just a temporary bridge, and we really need to start thinking long-term about how transportation is funded in this country and make a commitment to a new and different way of doing the funding. And it's a good time to start thinking about that, and a good time to start doing some pilot programs maybe to see how things begin to unfold differently.
Absolutely. You both alluded to this idea of how do we leverage the funds that we have. So I want to pivot to talking a little bit about the financing. Ideas, provisions, strategies that agencies can be using to help make sure that every dollar of funding that's available goes as far as possible. So just broadly, what role do you see financing strategies playing in terms of state and agency implementation of IIJA, aka BIL? And I will pick on Gail first. I can see you, and hopefully we'll have Anthony on audio soon.
Well, I can see Anthony. I'm not sure if we can hear him.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, so Anthony, I'd love to throw that one to you.
Yeah,
so you
let's give him a turn.
About the financing strategies, where you see maybe innovative procurements or P3s. What kind of projects should agencies be thinking about for those?
So, and I apologize, I'm thoroughly embarrassed from the challenges of trying to connect this morning, so get that out of the way. As far as strategies, one of the things I want to point out, the challenge with the IIJA and the P3 authorization, or what we originally perceived as advancement of P3, is really not an advancement of P3. So, any structured around incorporating P3 really hasn't changed. It's just put kind of a spotlight on the potential use of P3s. I see agencies like my own continuing down the traditional route of issuing bonds. We do have major projects out here, one of which is receiving some funding under the IIJA, and that's the Bridge. And we're years away from the decision on public finance versus a P3 model. So I think you're going to see a continuation of the traditional public finance model. I can't say that for all states, but states that are like Virginia that are more aggressive in the use of the P3 model, they'll continue.
David, any other thoughts on where and what kind of projects states will want to use innovative financing to pursue?
Yes. And Anthony, good to see you. I'm sorry you can't see me. I do think that I've seen some states, some clients moving around the colors of money, right? So if they had a project and the funding plan for that project previously included, state funds, some federal funds, and something else, right? Maybe it's bonds or what have you. I have seen some states starting to rethink those allocations, because now you're going to get a little bit more federal money, right? Just from your matching funds, but also from some of these discretionary grant programs. And so I have seen states thinking about, well, maybe we use TIFIA for this project where we didn't use it before, or maybe we'll be competitive for a grant for this project and we didn't use it before, and that'll save us on some of the state dollars that we've got here. So I have seen a little bit of that. So I won't call it rearranging the deck chairs, but really taking different colors of money and adjusting them. And to your original question, Catherine, I do think there are some things that are exciting here, like the expansion of PABs is great news. And I think that, TIFIA is a good example. The expanded use of TIFIA for other types of projects, airport projects and things like that, I think we will see a heavy lean in to those new categories, right? TIFIA is a great tool. And I think the fact that it's been expanded to other categories will help. So I do think that even though maybe IIJA didn't have what a lot of the P3 industry wanted in terms of sort of an expansion or a real push, a motivation to look at alternative delivery projects a little bit more closely when delivering, I do think there will be some increased interest in the financing tools that have been expanded under IIJA, even though it might not have been what we all wanted it to be.
Can I just chime in real quick on David's comment regarding TIFIA?
Please, Anthony.
So, David, you're absolutely correct. I think TIFIA is a wonderful tool from a state practitioner's level. We've taken advantage of TIFIA one time, and I still think that slow approach or the thought of taking on TIFIA is still a challenging one for states. Complexity in obtaining a TIFIA loan, the paperwork, the reporting. I can tell you, I came in after WashDOT took the TIFIA loan, and it's not that they said never again. It's like it's way at the bottom of the list of what we want to use. So
yeah, I hear you. Look, TIFIA is there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through, right? And I think states that have done it and continue to go back to the well have figured out how to sort of ease the what I will call the administrative inefficiencies with that process. But in a rising interest rate environment, right, with rising costs and everything else that's going on a macroeconomic level, man, that TIFIA, what TIFIA gives you in terms of interest rates and the ability to not start repaying until after substantial completion are some pretty compelling things that I see a lot more clients asking about. Now, Anthony, maybe to your point, after they go through the first one, they'll say, never again. But a lot of states who have used it are saying, well, when can we use it again? Just because I think they're seeing a lot in macroeconomic circles that are saying to them, man, there's a real low interest rate that we could be using here. So it'll be interesting to see. It's a good point, though.
I want to go back quickly to something that Gail mentioned earlier about new partnerships and the sort of interdisciplinary approach that the legislation takes and that it's pushing states to take. Anthony, Washington has created a pretty unique approach to EV charging, and you've established some partnerships outside of the DOT, outside of the traditional transportation sector. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the way that you all have approached EV charging in Washington?
Certainly, and the emphasis was on public-private partnerships for EV charging. Little by little, up until the IIJA monies and actually recent legislation in the state, we were appropriating about $1 million, $2 million a year to those partnerships between our local communities and a private sector entity to install charging along the corridors in Washington State. So we've been pretty successful there. The legislature actually increased their appropriation to the program by about $10 million. That combined with the monies from IIJA, what we see with the IIJA monies, our expectation is $71 million over 5 years. We'll do the first tranche of about $10 million. That layers right into the model that we've built with what we call our ZVIP program, Zero Emission Vehicles program. Again, it's all about incentivizing those partnerships between the public and the private sector. One of the things we really is with our focus on the corridors, we want our partners to understand we don't want to own the facilities, so we're incentivizing others to own the facility and manage and operate those facilities and keep them reliable. So your question is really well timed, because part of my challenge today, one of my other firestorms, is our legislature passed a bill. They ended session last week. They passed a bill that creates a clean car commission or council. That council will oversee a statewide plan for electric vehicle charging and just the incorporation of green energy throughout the state. That council will have oversight of how we deploy the federal funds. So we think it's important to maintain, with the other 8 members that will be appointed to the council, an emphasis on the partnerships aspect of all of this. And I would again say we've been really successful just on the West Coast in general in partnering with our partners to the north in BC, with our partners to the south in Oregon and California. We haven't ventured down into Mexico yet, but this is the home of the West Coast Electric Highway.
That's excellent. We do have a related question from the audience, so I want to toss this in right now. And it's, do you think that innovative or P3 delivery will help state DOTs to transition this shift in the new focuses that are presented in the IIJA/BIL? And they note that state DOTs sometimes have a difficult time shifting. So thoughts on, we've talked a little bit about the paradigm shift, the interdisciplinary approach, new partnerships. How is that actually going to play out within DOTs?
Is that a question to me, or is it a toss-up?
Anyone can jump. It's a jump ball.
So. Again, I've worked in a couple states now on transportation and P3s, and it just depends on where your state was before IIJA in the conversation and consideration for P3s. I mean, we know those states that are actively engaged with using P3 for transportation. There are far fewer of those than there are far more not engaged than there are that are engaged. I think that the IIJA has certainly created another buzz around the use of P3s, and it's up to this community of P3 practitioners to help move those states to the next level, to see, the IIJA provides a tremendous amount of resources that leveraging a P3, incorporated into a P3, can help really take on some of the work and accelerate the work. So it remains to be seen.
David or Gail, thoughts on how states will pivot in this new paradigm shift?
There's nothing like dangling a fair amount of federal funds and mandates in front of an agency to get them to move along. I do think that there is really an underlying theme, and whether this was really intentional on a broad scale or not is hard to say, but it's there nonetheless. There's really an underlying theme of expanding how you think about transportation, or expanding how you think about mobility, and expanding how you think about infrastructure, and inviting new partners to the table. And that underlying theme, I think, has an opportunity to encourage new partnerships in the form of P3s as well. This funding, more than in the past, I think, encourages multiple aspects to transportation, multiple aspects to a corridor, and thinking about new titles for things as opposed to the title just being highways or bridges, for the title being corridors, for the title being mobility. And it really encourages that to happen. And I think that those are the kinds of projects, and those projects, because they involve multiple components, might also be a bit more challenging financial side. So I think all of those things could very well encourage people to take a look at P3s as really not only sort of begrudgingly as a way to get something done, but maybe more as the way to get something done. If you're being asked to do things in a new and different way, it might expand those ideas. And we've mentioned a couple of times about the expansion of activity bonds and the expansion of TIFIA loans. Those are certainly can be challenging from sort of a bureaucratic standpoint, but it's also a lot of additional funding on the table that is very reasonably priced. And I think that that can only encourage states to take on some of these new efforts and see if they can make these broader and more innovative projects actually also be a bit more affordable.
Great point, Gail. David, did you want to add anything to that, or should we move on to talking a little bit about the bigger picture and the public perspective?
The only thing I would add, Catherine, is we may not see the P3s in the transportation space, right? There are a lot of eligible entities for discretionary grant programs that are on private sector this time around, right? Battery manufacturers for electric battery manufacturing and carbon utilization, projects. So what we're seeing is people starting to talk about, well, how can you take a P3 model? And maybe it's not the traditional DBFOM mega project concession, but maybe it's a smaller P3 or quasi P3 and apply it to some of these other categories of infrastructure that haven't historically been captured in the transportation realm.
Thanks for adding that. Okay, I want to take our practitioner hats off for a second and think a little bit about the public perspective. What are the public's expectations following this historic legislation? And is there a gap between expectation and reality in terms of what the general public, the residents of our states are thinking is going to happen as a result of this legislation?
Well, I'll jump in on that one first and let others pick up. My biggest fear personally about this is what David mentioned earlier, that everybody's going to go, oh, great, problem solved, lots of money. What do you mean you can't do that? That it's going to be perceived as being, one, more money than it actually is, and two, that the expanded needs combined with the declining revenue source and the gas tax somehow isn't going to eat into the available funds. So I think so that's my fear in this, and I think that puts a lot of pressure on transportation agencies, mostly DOTs, but others as well, to do something with this money. We really need to create the not the impression, we need to create the reality that this money is being used and used well. And it's a lot of money that includes a lot of things state agencies aren't accustomed to doing, and a lot of new partners they're not accustomed to working with, and they're facing the same workforce and supply chain challenges that we're all facing right now. So when you put all that together, I think it's quite, although it's all for good cause, it's all good news, I think that agencies are quite challenged or feeling quite challenged right now to deliver effectively on all of these new opportunities, and that they're just going to need a lot of help. It needs to be a partnership in many ways, and a lot of the workload needs to end up being shared, whether that's shared with private partners, shared with other state agencies, shared between MPOs and state DOTs. They need to find a way to get this work done in what's really a very challenging environment.
David and Anthony, other thoughts on the gap between expectation and reality, or potential solutions to making sure that we come out of this with everyone perceiving it to be a success?
Well, Gail captured it pretty well, and I'll probably be a little more crude. The public's fickle. we can have a robust network of charging stations, and that's really one of the big focuses for my program in Washington. We can have charging every 50 miles, and the public will appreciate it today, but tomorrow it's, what have you done for me lately? You know, in Washington State, our focus is on really preservation and protecting and maintaining and, you know, resilience, bringing our facilities up to a more stronger resiliency level. So that's things that the public doesn't appreciate. So I think that the success is going to be in the constant communication on how these monies are deployed. So, you know, there's a commentator back in Philadelphia that I enjoy. We have to see the billboards that says your tax dollars at work doing this, doing that. I mean, it's got to constantly be communicated to the public that here's your investment dollars at work. So,
David, anything to add?
No, well said by Anthony and Gail.
Okay, so we have a question that kind of, I want to dive a little bit more into strategies that agencies can use to be successful. And so we have a question from the audience that goes back to some of those discretionary programs we were talking about earlier, and specifically asking about the expansion in the number of potential recipients. So it's no longer the case that you know, our discretionary programs are geared towards DOTs. There's really a much larger pool of potential applicants. What role do DOTs play in sort of helping to manage that, or helping to control their own workflow in terms of the number of questions that are coming in the door from local partners?
So Catherine, you know, this kind of goes back to the question you asked me earlier about partnerships. And, you know, the federal government has done something unique with this legislation. And that's, and again, I'm speaking in transportation vein. There's a lot more going on in the broader stage that I appreciate, but haven't fully digested. This collaboration between energy and transportation, that's going to help us really meet a lot of new potential partners. So Washington has followed the same model in the creation of this council. This council that we're going to focus on in Washington for green energy incorporates our Commerce Department for Economic Development, which also controls our energy group. That's really, you know, 21st century, we're finally breaking down silos. That's going to help us meet the local needs much more aggressively and much quicker than we've done in the past, because we've always been myopically focused on highways, bridges, and in our case, ferries. Everything else, nothing else exists outside of that realm for us. In the 21st century, now we're starting to see the landscape and the layers upon layers and how these are interconnected, and that's really important. And I'm really happy to see it come out of this legislation.
David, anything to add there on discretionary grants and new recipients, expanded eligibility?
Yeah, I think Anthony said it well. I think a couple other things I'd like to add. One is, you know, out of all the eligible entities out there under IIJA who can go after discretionary grants, DOTs are really the only ones who have done this before, right? They institutionally, they know what it means to go after an infra grant or a RAISE grant or a Tiger grant. They have the internal capacity set up to do it. They have people who can help draft the grant applications. They have a monitoring framework in place about what you're lucky enough to get the grant. Now you have to monitor and report out on it. But all these new eligible entities, whether it's subrecipients, right, that will flow from DOT funds, or whether it's entities like departments of commerce for broadband or something else, they usually don't have any of that, right? And that institutional capacity is critical. And so I do think DOTs are going to be looked towards by other state partners, by other state agencies as being able to help. You know, with the infrastructure coordinators we've been talking to in states, they are oftentimes not focused on the DOT because they feel like, oh, the DOT's got this, right? They know how to do this. I need to focus on the Department of Natural Resources for some of these water grants, or I need to focus on my broadband department for the broadband grants and help build up the institutional capacity there. It's a lift, right? Like, this is going to be a lift for folks. And I think DOTs can be resources to help other agencies set up their institutional capacities. But anybody who has worked at a DOT or does work at a DOT, will tell you that they are very busy already. And I think that it will be a strain on DOTs, in part because they are the internal experts already on these kinds of things. So my hope is that the infrastructure coordinators can build up that institutional capacity, right? Whether it's with direct staff, whether it's through, temporary support, but putting together that strategy first about what you try to position yourself for, and then what do you actually apply for, what will you be competitive for, and what's your ROI going to be, and then actually administering the grants, that's going to be critical. And that can be a really robust framework, both in terms of the tools you use to manage it, but also the people you hire to manage it. So I'm hopeful that the DOTs can be a resource, but that they don't get taxed too much helping everybody else as they're trying to focus on their own funding streams.
Yeah, we have an audience question about just that topic. How should states think about balancing formula funding and then the huge number of discretionary grants? The scope is so much larger. It will be a challenge to predict and plan for such a stepped up discretionary role. So I think that's a concern for a lot of agencies. How many of these grants should you be chasing? How do you balance that in terms of your long-term planning when this funding is uncertain? How do you figure out what your ROI is, David?
Yeah, we're having that conversation right now with plenty of clients, right? How do you even start to think about this? Because the opportunities seem so vast, and the bill is, thousands of pages long. Even the guidance document that the White House published is 400 pages long. How do you sift through that and say, okay, here are some projects that we think might actually be worthy of getting a grant. Here are some programs that have grants that we think might match with those projects. What's the level of effort in putting forward a grant application? What is the match that's required? You really have to go through and think through all of that. And there are ways to do that, both strategically so that you can weed out a lot of the fluff, I think, at first, so you can identify those probably handful of grants that you will want to apply for. As Anthony can tell you, in applying for grants, DOTs are pretty careful not to compete against themselves, right? They want to make sure they're setting their best projects up to be competitive for grants. And I think infrastructure coordinators are going to have to be working with states so that they're not competing against themselves for some of these grant dollars. So it can be done. You might need help to do it, to think through it, unless that infrastructure coordinator role is going to be robustly staffed, because it does take a little bit of effort to sift through the law to match those programs up, top down and bottom up.
It's also, I just want to add, it's also, respecting the list of priorities you had before this funding, and then working with your partners to reprioritize where necessary, so that, you're not competing against yourself and you're not taking too much on. But, as state DOTs, we have a long list of priorities, and, the ones at the bottom third typically always stay in that bottom third. So, we'll review and look to see if there are any that could be, raised up that we could really give some focus to, with our partners and with, new funding opportunities. But again, I would say, you want to pay attention to those priorities you had before the funding became real.
I want to, oh, go ahead, Gail.
Sorry, I guess I would just say, since baseball is back, I guess I would just say that you can, you win the game with a combination of singles and home runs. Rarely does one home run win the game for you. So you really need to, to some extent, stay at home, do your jobs, manage the programs you have well, stick with your priorities and deliver them, but don't get so caught up in doing only that you miss the brave new world that's definitely coming out there, which is about partnerships and innovative approaches and expanding your thoughts of infrastructure into things like broadband deployment and vehicle charging and other fuels for the future, as well as I think one thing we haven't really mentioned yet is the role that the state DOTs play in freight and supply chain management. And I think that also needs to be an important priority, and where there's some discretionary funds, I think that's a good place to think about using them as well.
Thanks for raising that, Gail. We would have been, if we gotten to the end of the call and not talked about freight, we would have missed a major topic. So I want to just quickly go through each of the panelists for kind of final thoughts. Speaking to DOT practitioners, either, folks in your same role or in the roles that you used to have, strategies to be thinking about, keeping in mind as you wade through this, this very challenging time. So let me start with David.
Sure. I think my strategy, my recommendation, right, as a former practitioner and as someone who's advising practitioners today, goes back to what Anthony said earlier, right? Focus on what are your goals, what are your priorities, and what have they been, right? And keep that focus. This sort of magical pot of money that might be available shouldn't really change everything you've done to this point. Your STIP is your STIP, right? Your projects are your projects, your pipeline is your pipeline. You might want to reallocate some things in there or tweak some things, but keep that gold star or that North Star, right, in terms of your priorities. And then decide, okay, what is our target operating model about how to get there? Is it doing what we've been doing? Is it expanding our capacity to go after additional funding sources that haven't been there? Is it reprioritizing within those priority categories? But to me, that strategy really starts at the beginning. How do we want to approach this, right? Is it going to be very tactical, or do we want to really sort of, do a shotgun approach? And that takes some forethought up front that should really be guided by existing priorities. So for me, the big strategy is identify, based on those priorities, what you want your targets to be, your goals to be, and that'll really help, I think, folks sift through, separate the wheat from the chaff, and be able to position themselves well for some of the best opportunities for them that come from the IIJA.
Great advice, David. Who wants to go next with final words of wisdom? Anthony and Gail.
Okay, I'll take a shot at other than let it be as your final words of wisdom. I think David is spot on, and I think that the trick, the word of wisdom is keep your focus, manage what you have, but don't be afraid to wade into these new areas. This is your future. So stay home, but don't forget to look ahead, and don't forget to partner with those new entities and to loan your expertise, or give, not loan necessarily, give your expertise to all those other agencies and potential partners who now need you, and more importantly, now you need them as well. So I would say stay home, but don't close your eyes to the new opportunities that are out there, because there's a very, very, very good chance that this is a lot more what your future looks like than your past.
And mine is more altruistic, I guess, or maybe that's not the right word, but my priorities are given to me by a governor, a legislature, and a secretary. And in my role, we really act as consultants to the agency and to our local partners. But, I think the important thing here with the IIJA providing a tremendous amount of resources is to pay attention to the gaps and help identify those gaps. Specific to transportation, and I can relate it to other infrastructure areas, we're operating a transportation network built in the early 20th century, governed with 20th century federal regulations, and that hamstrings us a lot. So we're in the 21st century now. We are now breaking down silos, partway into the 21st century. With this IIJA, use it as an opportunity to identify and overcome, or work with our federal partners to overcome the additional gaps we may see. In Washington, we found a way to lean into issues of affordable housing, issues of, we're supposed to focus on building capacity and congestion relief and greenhouse gas emissions, but through our lean into the affordable housing conversation, we've been able to relate it to transportation, and working with our federal partners, get some flexibility in the future use of, neglected right-of-way. So use this as an opportunity to, take it to start working on 22nd century vision.
nice way to close. I will hand it back over to Susan Howard, our host, to wrap things up. But I just want to thank all of the panelists for your insights and your wisdom here. This has been a really excellent conversation. Susan?
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for moderating. Thanks to all of our panelists and all of those who participated today. We really appreciate it. As mentioned, we will have a recording of the webinar up on the website shortly, and as there's a plethora of resources there to help you as you're beginning to drill down into what is in the IIJA and how you can best take advantage of it. So appreciate you all being here and keep in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.